The station called Kethvorin hung in the void like a cathedral made of metal and starlight, spinning slowly in orbit around a star that had died long before any species in the galaxy had learned to speak. And it was here, in the largest hall ever built by thinking creatures, that the fate of humanity would be decided. Ambassador Jonah Marin stood at the entrance of the Galactic Arbitration Hall and looked up at the ceiling that stretched so far above him, it seemed to vanish into darkness. The walls curved inward like the inside of a great shell, lined with thousands of seats carved from pale stone, and every single one of them was filled. He had never seen so many alien species gathered in one place before. Tall, insectoid beings with wings folded against their backs sat beside short, furry creatures whose eyes glowed amber in the low light. Massive armored figures from the deep gravity worlds leaned forward in reinforced seats, while delicate translucent beings floated in suspension tanks filled with warm liquid. All of them were watching him, and all of them were waiting. Jonah wore a simple dark suit, no medals, no ceremonial armor, no symbols of rank, and he carried nothing but a single datapad tucked under his arm. He was 47 years old, with gray at his temples and deep lines around his eyes, and he walked with the steady, unhurried pace of a man who had already accepted whatever was coming. Behind him, the doors sealed shut with a sound that echoed through the chamber like a drumbeat. The tribunal sat at the far end of the hall on a raised platform made of black glass. 12 figures, each one representing one of the eldest species in the Conquered, civilizations that had sailed between the stars for tens of thousands of years before humanity had even learned to make fire. They looked down at Jonah with expressions that ranged from boredom to mild curiosity, the way one might look at a small animal that had wandered into a room where it did not belong. The presiding judge was a Valori, a being that resembled a tall, impossibly thin human with skin the color of deep water and 4 arms folded neatly across its chest. Its name was Tribunal First Ashai, and it had overseen more than 300 interstellar disputes in its lifetime. It had never lost a moment of sleep over any of them. The Conquered recognizes the presence of the representative from Earth, Ashai said, its voice filling the chamber without effort. You have been summoned to answer charges brought by the Drailleth Hegemony regarding unauthorized expansion into the Verath corridor. Do you understand the nature of these proceedings? Jonah stopped at the center of the chamber floor, a single human figure standing in a circle of light surrounded by thousands of alien faces, and he nodded once. I understand, he said. His voice was calm and clear, and it carried well in the silence. From the right side of the platform, a figure rose, Archon Sivelk of the Drailleth Hegemony. He was enormous, nearly 8 feet tall, with scales the color of dried blood and eyes like molten copper. His jaw was lined with short curved teeth that showed when he spoke, and he wore a cloak of dark metal links that clinked softly as he moved. He had the posture of a predator who had never once been prey. Tribunal first, Sivelk said, and his voice was low and smooth like stone grinding against stone. The hegemony's position is simple. The humans have placed settlements in a region that borders our sovereign territory without permission, without consultation, and without regard for the stability of this quadrant. We demand the immediate removal of all human installations in the Verath corridor and the placement of Earth under protective wardship to prevent further reckless expansion. A murmur rolled through the gallery. Protective wardship. Everyone in the room knew what that meant. It meant humanity would lose its seat in the Conquered, lose its right to independent governance, and become a subject species under Drailleth control. 3 other civilizations had accepted wardship in the past century, and none of them had ever recovered their independence. Sivelk sat down, with the calm satisfaction of someone who had done this many times before. Ashai turned its pale blue gaze toward Jonah. The representative from Earth may respond. Jonah did not speak right away. He stood very still and let the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable, until the rustling and murmuring in the gallery faded and every eye in the chamber was fixed on him. And then he looked up at the tribunal, not at Sivelk, not at the gallery, but directly at the 12 eldest beings in the room, and he spoke. Tribunal first. I do not contest that humanity established outposts in the Verath corridor. We did. I will explain why, and I will present evidence that will make the reason clear to every being in this hall. But to do that properly, I am invoking my right under Article 9 of the Concord's founding charter to request a full evidentiary hearing with historical context. The chamber went quiet in a different way now, not the silence of waiting but the silence of surprise. Article 9 had not been invoked in over 200 years. Most of the beings in the room had never heard of it, but it was there, written into the oldest laws of the Concord, and it could not be denied. Ashai tilted its head slightly. You are aware that a full evidentiary hearing could take several sessions. I am, Jonah, and you are aware that you have no legal counsel present, no support delegation, and no diplomatic team. I am aware of that as well. Then who will present your evidence? Jonah held up the single datapad in his hand and allowed himself the smallest of smiles. I will. A ripple of quiet laughter moved through the gallery, not cruel exactly, but disbelieving. One human, alone with a datapad, standing against the Drailleth Hegemony. It was almost sad. Ashai studied Jonah for a long moment, and something shifted behind its ancient eyes, not respect, not yet, but perhaps the faintest flicker of interest. Very well, the tribunal first said. The request is granted. The first evidentiary session will begin at the next cycle. This chamber is adjourned. The gallery began to empty, thousands of beings rising and moving toward the exits in a slow river of bodies and voices and clicking limbs. Jonah remained where he was, standing in the circle of light, watching them go. From across the chamber, Archon Sivelt caught his eye. The Drailleth leader did not look angry or threatened. He looked amused, the way a hunter looks at something small that has decided to stand its ground instead of running. Sivelt turned to the aide beside him, a younger Drailleth with nervous eyes, and spoke quietly enough that no one else could hear. He is delaying, Sivelt said. That is all this is, a delay. I have done this 40 times and no young species has ever survived a tribunal challenge from us. Not once. This human will fold before the second session, and then we will have Earth on its knees where it belongs. The aide nodded quickly, eager to agree. But as they turned to leave, the aide glanced back one more time at the human still standing alone in the center of that vast and ancient hall, small, quiet, unmoving. And for reasons the aide could not explain, a cold unease settled in the pit of its stomach and refused to leave. By the time the first evidentiary session began, the gallery was full again, fuller, in fact, than it had been the day before. Word had traveled fast through the station and beyond, carried on encrypted channels and whispered in trading posts and embassy halls across the quadrant. A human was fighting back against the Drailleth Hegemony, alone, and nobody wanted to miss what happened next. Jonah Marin entered the chamber the same way he had the first time, unhurried, steady, carrying nothing but his datapad, and took his place in the circle of light at the center of the floor. He looked rested, which surprised the beings watching from the gallery, because most of them had assumed he would spend the night in a state of growing panic. Tribunal First Ashai called the session to order and gestured toward Jonah with one of its 4 slender arms. You may begin. Jonah thanked the tribunal and then did something no one expected. He did not talk about the Verath corridor at all. Instead, he asked the tribunal for permission to exercise his right under Article 9 to present historical context before addressing the specific charges. Ashai granted the request with a slight nod, and Sivelt, seated in his place on the platform, leaned back with the expression of someone settling in, for a performance he had already decided was beneath him. Jonah raised his datapad and projected a holographic display into the air above the chamber floor, a star map showing a region of space that most of the elder species would recognize immediately. It was the Kelver Expanse, a dense cluster of systems on the far side of the hegemony's territory. 612 years ago, Jonah said, his voice carrying clearly through the silence, a species called the Mavari lived in this region. They were a peaceful civilization, scientists, artists, builders of some of the most beautiful orbital structures ever recorded in conquered archives. They had a population of 9 billion spread across 4 worlds. He changed the display. The star map was replaced by a graph, a population curve that rose steadily for centuries and then dropped like a cliff falling into the sea. The Drailleth Hegemony initiated a border dispute with the Mavari in cycle 4170. The conquered brokered a resolution that placed the Mavari under Drailleth protective wardship. Within 80 years, their population had fallen to 400 million. Within 150 years, they were gone. The conquered's official record lists their status as voluntarily integrated. Jonah paused and looked up at the gallery. They were not voluntarily integrated. They were erased. A low murmur rippled through the chamber. Archon Scivalk's copper eyes narrowed, but he did not move. Jonah brought up another star map, a different region, a different species. The Athani, population 11 billion. Wardship began in cycle 4400 after a trade dispute that the hegemony escalated into a territorial claim. The Athani resisted for 30 years before accepting terms. Within 2 centuries, they had ceased to exist as a distinct civilization. Official record, voluntarily integrated. He changed the display again. The Brevari, population 6 billion. A gentle species, herbivores, known across the conquered for their contributions to medicine and biological science. Wardship imposed in cycle 4620 following allegations of illegal resource extraction that were never independently verified. They lasted 90 years. Official record, voluntarily integrated. Jonah lowered the datapad and let the silence fill the room. 3 species, 3 civilizations, billions of lives, all reduced to 2 words in a file that nobody had bothered to open in centuries. Then he turned, not to the tribunal, but to the gallery, to the hundreds of species watching from the curved stone seats above. These are not distant abstractions, he said. These were people. They had languages and holidays and songs they sang to their children at night. They built things and dreamed things and believed that the conquered, this institution, this hall, this promise of galactic cooperation, would protect them when they needed it most. He paused again, and when he spoke next his voice was quieter but somehow sharper. It did not. Archon Scivalk rose from his seat. Tribunal first, I must object. This historical presentation has no relevance to the charges at hand. The human is engaging in theater to distract from his species' illegal actions in the Verath corridor. Ashai considered the objection for a moment and then looked at Jonah. The representative will clarify the relevance of this material to the current proceedings. Jonah nodded. Tribunal first. The pattern I am describing is directly relevant because the same pattern is now being applied to humanity. A border dispute is manufactured. Wardship is demanded, and the expectation is that the younger species will comply or be crushed. I'm establishing that this is not an isolated incident but a deliberate and repeated strategy that has resulted in the destruction of multiple civilizations under the watch of this very tribunal. The words landed like stones thrown into still water. Several of the elder tribunal members shifted in their seats. Ashai's expression did not change, but its 4 hands tightened almost imperceptibly against the arms of its chair. The objection is noted but overruled, Ashai said. Continue. Scivalk sat down slowly, and for the first time since the proceedings began, the mask of calm amusement on his face showed a crack, just a small one, just for a moment, but Jonah saw it, and so did everyone else. Over the next 2 sessions, Jonah continued to build his case, not about the Verath corridor, not about humanity, but about the Drailleth hegemony's history. He presented trade records showing how the hegemony had systematically strangled the economies of warship species. He showed communications intercepted decades ago and buried in conquered archives that proved the Drailleth had deliberately provoked several of the disputes they later used as justification for expansion. He named every species. He showed their faces, their art, their architecture. He made the gallery look at what had been lost. And through it all, he spoke in the same calm, steady voice, never raising it, never breaking, never performing. He was not trying to win sympathy. He was building something, brick by brick, and only he knew what the final structure would look like. By the end of the second session, several species in the gallery had begun to look uncomfortable, not because of the Drailleth, but because of themselves. Some of the elder civilizations had sat on this very tribunal when the Mavari and the Athani and the Brevari had been placed under wardship. They had voted to approve it, or at the very least they had looked away and let it happen. Jonah had not accused them directly. He did not need to. The evidence spoke for itself, and the silence of the beings who had allowed it was louder than anything he could have said. At the close of the second session, HFY leaned forward and addressed Jonah with a note of impatience that was unusual for a being of its age and station. Representative Marin, you have presented extensive historical material, but you have not yet addressed the charges against your species. The tribunal requires you to do so at the next session. Jonah looked up at the tribunal first and nodded, and then he said something that made every being in the chamber lean forward. I needed the tribunal to remember what it has chosen to forget. Now I will show you what humanity found in the Varath corridor. The session ended, and the gallery emptied in near silence. No chatter, no debate, just the quiet shuffle of thousands of beings lost in their own unease. Archon Sivelk remained seated on the platform long after the others had gone. His aide approached carefully and asked if the Archon wished to return to his quarters. Sivelk did not answer right away. He stared at the empty circle of light where the human had stood, and his copper eyes held something they had never held before in 40 tribunal challenges. Not anger, not contempt, but the first cold seed of genuine concern. The third session drew the largest audience the arbitration hall had ever seen in its long and ancient history. Species who had no stake in the dispute and no alliance with either side had sent observers from across the galaxy, arriving on fast ships and cramming themselves into every available seat and standing space in the chamber. Even the corridors outside were filled with beings watching on projected screens, their murmuring voices creating a low hum that vibrated through the walls like the pulse of a living thing. Jonah Marin walked into the chamber and took his place in the circle of light and waited for silence. It came faster than before, not because the gallery was smaller, but because no one wanted to miss a single word. Tribunal First HFY opened the session with a directness that had been absent in previous days. Representative Marin, you will now address the charges against humanity regarding the Varath corridor. The tribunal will hear your explanation for the unauthorized settlements. Jonah nodded and raised his datapad. A new holographic display appeared above the chamber floor. Not a population graph this time, not a star map, but a series of high-resolution images taken from the surface of a barren world. 14 months ago, Jonah began, Earth's Deep Space Exploration Division detected anomalous signals coming from 3 systems inside the Varath corridor. The signals were faint and intermittent, and they did not match any known natural phenomenon. We sent survey teams to investigate, and what they found is the reason we built those outposts. He changed the display. The images shifted to show vast underground structures, broken corridors, collapsed chambers, the skeletal remains of buildings that had once been beautiful and were now nothing but dust and ruin. These are the remains of the Mavari, Jonah said. Not cultural artifacts preserved in a museum, not records in an archive, but the places where they actually lived, the cities they built beneath the surface of their colony worlds in the corridor. cities that the Conquered's official records say never existed, because the Mavari were supposedly integrated peacefully into the hegemony. The gallery was very still. Jonah brought up a second set of images, another world, another set of ruins, deeper underground and more thoroughly destroyed. These are Athani structures, and these, he shifted to a third display, are breviary. 3 species, 3 sets of ruins, all in the Varath corridor, all buried, all deliberately concealed. Archon Sivok leaned forward in his seat. His copper eyes were fixed on the display with an intensity that made his aide take a small step backward. "And now," Jonah said, his voice dropping lower, "I need to show you what else we found." The holographic display changed again. This time it showed ground-penetrating scan data, layers of soil and rock peeled back digitally to reveal what lay beneath the ruins. The image resolved slowly, and as it did, a sound moved through the gallery that was not quite a gasp and not quite a whisper, but something in between, a collective intake of breath from 1,000 different lungs and breathing organs. Mass graves, hundreds of them, row after row of remains buried in deep trenches that stretched for kilometers beneath the surface of all 3 worlds. "Our forensic teams analyzed the remains," Jonah said. "The cause of death in the majority of cases was consistent with high-energy weapons fire, specifically plasma-based armaments of a type that matches Drailleth military technology from the relevant time periods. These people were not integrated. They were not relocated. They were killed, and they were buried in secret, and no one came looking for them." The silence in the chamber had changed. It was no longer the silence of attention, but the silence of something far heavier. The silence of beings who were beginning to understand that the history they had accepted for centuries was a lie. Jonah was not finished. "Our teams recovered one more thing," he said. "A data core, buried in a sealed vault beneath the largest Mavari settlement. It had been protected by a shielding system that kept it intact for over 500 years. Most of the data was corrupted beyond recovery, but we were able to extract one file, an audio transmission." He looked up at the tribunal. "With your permission, I would like to play it." Ashai nodded slowly. Sivok opened his mouth as if to object, but no sound came out. Jonah touched his datapad, and a voice filled the chamber, thin and distorted by centuries of degradation, but unmistakably real, unmistakably alive, unmistakably afraid. It spoke in the Mavari language, which the hall's translation systems converted in real time so that every being present could understand. "This is Keeper Talvani of the Mavari colony ascending light. We are under attack. Drailleth forces have breached the outer settlements and are moving inward. We have sent 17 emergency transmissions to the Galactic Conquered over the past 40 days and have received no response. Our population centers are being destroyed. Our people are being killed. We are begging anyone who can hear this, please. We are still here. Please do not forget us." The transmission ended. The room fell silent. It was a silence so absolute and so heavy that it seemed to have physical weight, pressing down on every being in the chamber like the gravity of a collapsing star. No one moved. No one spoke. 1,000 species sat frozen in their seats and stared at the empty air where the voice of a dead civilization had just spoken its last words. Jonah stood in the center of it, all with his head slightly bowed and his eyes closed, and he let the silence do what no argument could. Then Archon Sivok stood. His voice was harder than it had been before, stripped of its earlier smoothness and carrying an edge like broken glass. "This evidence is fabricated," he said. "The humans have constructed these remains and manufactured this transmission to justify their illegal occupation of the corridor. I demand that this hearing be closed immediately and that the tribunal disregard this theatrical display." Ashai turned to Sivok with an expression that even the most ancient beings in the room had never seen on a tribunal first's face. Not anger exactly, but a coldness that went beyond anger into something far more dangerous. The tribunal will not close this hearing, Ashai said. An independent verification team will be dispatched to the Verath corridor to examine the evidence. Until that verification is complete, these proceedings are suspended. Sivok's jaw tightened, and if the evidence is found to be genuine, then we will reconvene, Ashai said, and the nature of this proceeding will change considerably. Jonah raised his hand. Ashai acknowledged him. Tribunal first, Jonah said. I anticipated that the authenticity of the evidence would be questioned, and I want to assure the tribunal and the gallery that verification will be straightforward. Because as of 6 hours ago, complete copies of all data, all scan results, all forensic analyses, and the full audio transmission have been transmitted simultaneously to every species in the Galactic Concord through open diplomatic channels. The murmur that followed was not quiet. It rolled through the gallery like a wave breaking against rocks. Shock, disbelief, and something that might have been admiration all tangled together. Sivok stared at Jonah, and for the first time in the entire proceeding, the Drailleth Archon looked like a creature that had just realized the ground beneath its feet was not as solid as it had believed. Jonah met his gaze without flinching. The evidence cannot be suppressed, Jonah said simply. It belongs to everyone now. Ashai adjourned the session, and the gallery began to empty, but slowly this time, reluctantly, as if the beings inside were not sure they wanted to leave the chamber and face what was waiting outside. The universe had shifted, and everyone in the room could feel it. As Jonah turned to leave, Ashai's voice reached him from the platform, quiet enough that only he could hear. How long have your people known? Jonah paused and looked back at the ancient being, thousands of years old, witness to the rise and fall of civilizations, keeper of laws that were meant to protect the weak and had failed again and again and again. Since before we accepted our seat in this hall, Jonah said. Ashai stared at him for a long moment, and something shifted deep behind those pale blue eyes, something that might have been the beginning of understanding, or perhaps the beginning of fear. Jonah walked out of the chamber alone, his footsteps echoing in the vast and silent hall, carrying the weight of 3 dead civilizations and the hope of one that refused to follow them into the dark. The days that followed the 3rd session were unlike anything the station Keth Vorin had experienced in its thousands of years of existence. The carefully maintained order of the Galactic Concord, built on centuries of quiet agreements, unspoken hierarchies, and the comfortable fiction that the elder species always knew best, began to crack like ice under pressure. It started with the Selvani, a mid-tier species that had lived under a Drailleth trade agreement for the past 90 years. Their ambassador stood up in the open forum hall on the 2nd day after the session and demanded a full review of every treaty the hegemony had ever imposed on a younger civilization. Within hours, 4 more species had joined the demand. By the end of that day, the number had risen to 11. On the 3rd day, 3 elder species, the Velori, the Keenth, and the Drailleth, quietly withdrew their long-standing diplomatic support for the Drailleth hegemony. They did not make public statements. They simply stopped answering Sivok's communications and recalled their ambassadors from Drailleth space. It was the political equivalent of a building losing its foundation, and everyone on the station could feel the structure beginning to sway. Jonah Marin watched all of this from his small quarters on the station's lower ring, a modest room with a narrow bed, a desk, and a viewport that looked out at the dead star around which Keth Vorin orbited. He ate simple meals alone and answered no interview requests and spent most of his time reading messages on his datapad with an expression that gave nothing away. On the 4th day, everything changed. Archon Sivok, who had been conspicuously absent from all public forums since the 3rd session, appeared on every open communication channel in the Concord simultaneously. His face filled screens across the station, and his voice, cold, controlled, and carrying the unmistakable tone of a threat wrapped in formal language. delivered a message that made the blood of every diplomat on Keth Vorin run cold. The Drailleth Hegemony recognizes that the current proceedings have been compromised by fabricated evidence and political manipulation, Sci-Fi said. We no longer consider the tribunal a legitimate venue for resolution of this matter. Accordingly, the Hegemony's Third Fleet has been mobilized to the border of the Verath corridor. The human settlements will be removed. Earth's government has 40 hours to withdraw all personnel and equipment from the corridor, or the Hegemony will remove them by force. This is not a negotiation. The transmission ended, and panic spread through the station like fire through dry wood. Emergency sessions were called in every forum and council chamber. Ambassadors shouted at each other across tables while aides scrambled to contact their homeworlds. The conquered had no unified military force. It had never needed one, because the elder species had always maintained order through economic pressure and political maneuvering, and because no one had ever been foolish enough to openly defy the Drailleth. The consensus among most species was swift and grim. Humanity would have to withdraw. Earth's fleet was small, young, and untested against the battle-hardened warships of the Hegemony. Fighting would mean destruction, and no sane government would sacrifice its people in a war they could not win. Several ambassadors sought out Jonah to urge him to accept the inevitable. They came to his quarters one by one, speaking in careful diplomatic language that all amounted to the same thing: surrender now, survive, and perhaps in a few centuries the balance of power would shift enough to try again. Jonah listened to each of them politely, thanked them for their concern, and sent them away without giving an answer. On the morning of the 5th day, with 18 hours remaining on Sci-Fi's ultimatum, Jonah left his quarters and walked to the station's central communications hub. A vast room filled with transmission equipment capable of reaching every corner of the galaxy. The technicians on duty were Keenth, small six-limbed beings with quick hands and nervous dispositions, and they watched with wide dark eyes as the human ambassador entered and asked to use an open channel. "What frequency?" the lead technician asked. "All of them," Jonah said. The technician hesitated, looked at its colleagues, and then configured the array. A light on the console turned green, and Jonah stepped up to the transmitter. The message he sent was short, and it was broadcast on every open channel available: military, diplomatic, commercial, and civilian. Every ship in range heard it, every station picked it up, and every government in the conquered received it within minutes. "This is Ambassador Jonah Marin of Earth. I am addressing the Drailleth Third Fleet directly. Humanity will not withdraw from the Verath corridor. The evidence we have presented is authentic, and it belongs to the galaxy. We will defend our outposts and the graves of the Mavari, the Athani, and the Brevari, not because we seek war, but because some things must be protected even at great cost." He paused, and when he spoke again his voice carried something that had not been there before: not anger, not defiance, but a quiet certainty that seemed to fill the room. "And we are not alone." For 12 hours, nothing happened. The Drailleth fleet held its position at the edge of the corridor, and the galaxy held its breath. On the station, species argued and paced and calculated the odds of humanity's survival, and almost every calculation came back the same: impossible. And then, 6 hours before the deadline, the sensors on Keth Vorin detected a massive, faster-than-light signature emerging at the edge of the Verath corridor. It was not one ship, it was not 10, it was a fleet, and it kept growing. The first vessels to arrive were Selvani cruisers, sleek and silver, forming a defensive line alongside the 4 small human frigates already stationed at the corridor's entrance. Behind them came Torvani destroyers, heavy and scarred from years of border patrol. Then Jeskari scout ships, fast and agile, fanning out in a wide sensor net. Then Albeth carriers, each one housing hundreds of fighter craft. Then more Penari, Kalisi, Drothian, moving ship after ship after ship, dropping out of faster-than-light travel, and taking position in a formation that spread across the mouth of the corridor like a wall made of light and metal. 32 species, over 400 warships, a fleet assembled not by conquest or coercion, but by something the elder species had never considered a strategic asset: trust. The truth emerged in fragments over the following hours as the galaxy scrambled to understand what had happened. For 11 years, since the day humanity had first taken its seat in the Concord, Earth's diplomats had been quietly building relationships with younger and mid-tier species across the galaxy. Not military alliances announced with fanfare, but simple agreements, trade partnerships, shared research, medical missions to worlds that the elder species had deemed too unimportant to help. When a plague had swept through the Selvani agricultural worlds, it was human doctors who had arrived first. When the Torvani had been denied access to a critical shipping lane by Drailleth tariffs, it was human negotiators who had helped them find an alternative route. When the Jeskari had lost 3 colony ships to a navigation system failure, it was human engineers who had spent 6 months helping them rebuild. None of it had been done with the expectation of repayment. None of it had come with conditions or demands. And yet when Jonah's message went out, when he said, "We are not alone," every one of those species had answered within hours, committing ships and crews to defend a set of outposts on the edge of nowhere because the people who had helped them when no one else would have asked. On the bridge of the Drailleth flagship, Archon Cyvelk stood before the tactical display and watched as the Allied fleet continued to grow. The copper light in his eyes flickered as his officers updated the count. 400, 450, still climbing. His second-in-command stood beside him, rigid with barely controlled unease. "Archon," the officer said carefully, "our fleet has the advantage in individual firepower, but their numbers and the diversity of their vessel types create significant tactical complications. If we engage, losses would be." "I can see the numbers," Cyvelk said. The bridge was quiet except for the low hum of the ship's engines and the soft chirp of sensors tracking the growing wall of Allied vessels. Cyvelk stared at the display for a long time, and then he spoke, not to his officer, not to his bridge crew, but almost to himself, as if he were trying to understand something that did not fit inside the framework of everything he had ever known. "When did they build this?" His second-in-command looked at the display and then back at the Archon, and answered with an honesty that surprised them both. "They did not build it, Archon, they earned it." Cyvelk said nothing. He stood before the tactical display as the deadline passed, and the Allied fleet held its position, and the Drailleth Third Fleet, the most feared military force in the quadrant, did not fire a single shot. 12 hours later, the Hegemony's ships turned and withdrew from the corridor in silence, and the galaxy exhaled. 1 week after the Drailleth fleet withdrew from the Verath corridor, the tribunal reconvened, and the arbitration hall on Keth Vorin filled with more beings than had ever gathered in one place in the recorded history of the Galactic Concord. Every species had sent representatives, not just ambassadors and diplomats, but scientists, historians, military leaders, artists, teachers, and ordinary citizens who had traveled across the galaxy, because they understood that what was about to happen in this chamber would define the shape of their civilization for generations to come. The curved stone seats were full from the lowest tier to the highest. The corridors were packed. The projection screens outside the hall drew crowds that stretched the entire length of the station. And at the center of it all, in the circle of light on the chamber floor, stood a single human being with a datapad and tired eyes and hands that he kept very still at his sides. Tribunal First Ashai called the session to order. Its voice was different now, slower, more deliberate, as if each word carried a weight it had not carried before. "The independent verification team has completed its examination of the evidence presented by the representative from Earth," Ashai said. "The team's findings confirm the authenticity of all materials, including the archaeological surveys, the forensic analyses, and the recovered audio transmission. The remains of 3 distinct civilizations have been positively identified in the Varath corridor, and the evidence of their destruction is consistent with the claims made in this chamber. The words settled over the gallery like snow falling on a silent field. Everyone had expected this, but hearing it spoken aloud by the tribunal first in this hall made it real in a way that nothing else could. HFY turned to the Drailleth delegation. The Archon may address the tribunal. Sci-Fi rose. He was still enormous, still imposing, but something had changed in the way he held himself. The easy predatory confidence was gone, replaced by a rigidity that looked like control, but was closer to the stiffness of a creature that knows it is cornered. The Drailleth Hegemony acknowledges the findings of the verification team, Sci-Fi said, and a murmur ran through the gallery because no one had expected him to concede even that much. However, the events described occurred centuries ago under previous leadership, and the current hegemony bears no responsibility for actions taken by administrations that no longer exist. We are prepared to renegotiate the terms of our relationship with the conquered, and to discuss modifications to existing wardship agreements in the interest of galactic stability. It was a performance, polished, measured, and entirely hollow. Sci-Fi was offering to adjust the terms of an arrangement that everyone in the room now understood had been built on genocide, and he was doing it with the calm authority of someone who still believed that the galaxy's memory was short enough and its courage weak enough to let him get away with it. Jonah watched him speak and said nothing. He stood in his circle of light with his hands at his sides and his expression unreadable, and he waited. HFY looked at Sci-Fi for a long moment after the Archon finished, and then turned to Jonah. The representative from Earth may respond. Jonah did not speak right away. He stood in the silence and let it grow, not the way he had in the first session, as a tactic to draw attention, but the way a person stands when they are gathering something from deep inside themselves, something important that they want to get exactly right. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, and the entire chamber leaned forward to hear him. "I am not going to talk about the Drailleth Hegemony," he said. A flicker of confusion passed through the gallery. "I am not going to talk about the Varath corridor, or the fleet that came to defend it, or the political crisis that this tribunal now faces. Those things are important, and they will be dealt with, but they are not what I came here to say." He looked up at the gallery, not at the tribunal, not at Sci-Fi, but at the thousands of faces watching him from every direction, and he spoke to them. "I want to talk about this hall. I want to talk about what it was supposed to be." He turned slowly, taking in the vast curved walls, the ancient stone, the light that fell from above like something almost sacred. When the Galactic conquered was founded, the species who built it had a vision, a galaxy where no civilization, no matter how small or young or different, would be left to face the darkness alone. They carved this hall out of stone and metal, and they wrote laws to protect the vulnerable, and they created a system that was supposed to mean something. And for a long time, it did. His voice was steady, unhurried, and so simple that it cut through every layer of political calculation and diplomatic maneuvering in the room, and reached the part of every being that still remembered why civilizations reach for the stars in the first place. But somewhere along the way, that vision became a convenience, something to invoke when it served the powerful and to ignore when it did not. 3 species sent messages to this conquered begging for help, and no one answered. Their worlds were burned and their people were buried in unmarked graves, and the record was changed to say they had simply chosen to disappear. And the galaxy moved on because it was easier to move on than to ask difficult questions. He paused and let his gaze settle on the tribunal, 12 ancient beings looking down at him from their platform of black glass. "I did not come here to destroy the Drailleth Hegemony. I did not come here to humiliate this tribunal, and I did not come here to declare that humanity is better than anyone else in this room, because we are not. Our own history is full of the same failures, the same silences, the same willingness to look away when looking would have cost us something. Something shifted in the chamber. A tension that had been building for days began to change shape, turning from confrontation into something rawer and more vulnerable. We came to the stars because we had spent our entire history on one small world learning what happens when good people choose silence over truth. We learned it in our wars, in our atrocities, in the graves we dug for each other, and the monuments we built afterward, and the promises we made and broke and made again. We learned it the hard way, the only way humans seem to learn anything. And when we finally reached the stars and found this conquered in this hall, we hoped that the galaxy had learned it too. He lowered his eyes for a moment, and when he raised them again, there was something in them that was not political and not strategic and not calculated. It was personal, and it was real, and every being in the chamber could feel it. The Mavari's last transmission was not a curse. It was not a condemnation. It was a plea they called out to this conquered because they believed in it. They believed that someone would hear them and someone would come. And when I listened to that transmission for the first time in a lab on Earth, I made a promise that their faith would not be wasted forever. He straightened and addressed the full chamber one final time. I am not asking for the hegemony's destruction. I am asking for accountability. A full and independent tribunal to investigate the deaths of the Mavari, the Athani, and the Brevari. Reparations for every species that has suffered under forced wardship, and a restructuring of this conquered so that no single species or alliance can ever again silence the calls of the vulnerable. These are not demands from humanity. They are obligations that this institution owes to the dead and to every civilization that will come after us. He took a breath. You expected us to collapse. Every young species before us did. But we are not here to survive your galaxy. We are here to make it worthy of the beings who live in it. The silence that followed was unlike any that had come before. It was not the silence of shock or the silence of surprise. It was the silence of recognition. The silence of beings who were seeing themselves clearly, perhaps for the first time, and finding the reflection painful but not hopeless. And then slowly a single figure in the gallery stood, a Selvani ambassador, small and silver-furred, rising from its seat with its hands pressed together in the Selvani gesture of commitment. Beside it, a Torvani officer rose, then a Jeskari, then a Penari, then a Keenth and an Albeth and a dozen others and then 100 others, species after species standing not in applause and not in celebration but in acknowledgement. A quiet, solemn recognition that the human was right, and that it was not too late. The wave moved through the gallery like a tide, slowly at first, then faster, then unstoppable, until even the elder species began to rise, one by one, their ancient bodies straightening in their seats as something long dormant stirred inside them. The tribunal voted unanimously. The hearing against humanity was dismissed. A full war crimes investigation into the Drailleth Hegemony was authorized. The restructuring commission was approved. And Archon Cyvelk, recalled to his homeworld by his own government before the session had even ended, left the chamber without looking back. Jonah remained in the circle of light until the hall was empty and the last echoes of movement had faded into silence. Then he walked back to his quarters on the lower ring and closed the door behind him and sat on the edge of his narrow bed. His hands were shaking. They had been shaking since before he walked into the chamber, and he had kept them still through sheer force of will for over an hour. Now, alone, he let them tremble. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small locket, old, scratched, made of real metal rather than the synthetic materials that most humans used. He opened it and looked at the photograph inside, a girl, maybe 8 years old, with dark hair and her father's serious eyes, and a gap-toothed smile that could make a broken man believe the universe was still capable of kindness. He held the locket in his shaking hands and pressed it against his forehead, and closed his eyes. "We did it," he whispered. He was not a hero. He was not a legend. He was a father who had looked at the stars and decided that his daughter deserved a universe that did not turn its back on the voiceless. And for the first time in a very long while, the galaxy had listened.